Welcome to Creative Solutions for a New World, Climate and Artists Series. I'm Frances Littman, your host. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Peoples worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationship by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. There are three very important words in life: honesty, truth, and respect. Without this, there's nothing. Today, you will hear from internationally acclaimed speakers, scholars, authors, and a psychologist about the science behind truth, with interesting stories, facts, and examples of how truth has become unanchored, is undermining science, and creating roadblocks to a common public understanding of the risks and challenges for tackling climate change and biodiversity loss, and what it'll take to get back on track. We're honored to have Dr. Andrew Hoffman, Mace Rosenstein, and Dr. David Fellow as our U.S. guests, with United Nations World Water Chair Bob Sanford rejoining for a lively and engaged webinar. We'll answer questions live closer to the end of the program, so I hope you'll use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have a question and would like it answered. I'd like to thank our esteemed Climate and the Arts partner, Jonathan O'Riordan. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment dedicated to supporting climate action and the arts while honoring his late wife, professional cellist Gail O'Riordan. I'd like to introduce Bob Sanford. Bob Sanford is an award-winning author and editor of more than 35 books. He holds the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. He'll explore how Canada is not only immune from the use of misinformation that we need to be on guard for but he'll also help us have a civil discourse on what it takes to protect and preserve what we have. Welcome, Bob. What an incredible program we have today.
Well, thank you very much, Frances, and thank you very much for all the organizational capacity that you commit to this. And if I may, it's my privilege to introduce the first of the other two panelists in our session, a prominent Washington lawyer who deals with large-scale media law and regulation. But this man is also an astute political and social observer and has been a regular panelist and commentator on the Creatively United webinar series. Mace Rosenstein. Welcome, Mace.
Thank you, Bob. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here again. And let me, in turn, introduce Dr. David Fellow, who is a clinical psychologist and adjunct associate professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. He's speaking to us today from Washington, D.C. David and I have known each other and worked together for many, many years. David has both engaged in and supervised clinical practice for the past 45 years and published many papers and book chapters. And our portion of the program today is, well, we're trying a couple of new things. We hope you like them. But for the next 20 minutes or so, David and Bob and I are going to be talking to you about fear, lies, and rock and roll.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
For What It's Worth by the Buffalo Springfield seems an appropriate way to introduce an exploration today of lies, delusion, and paranoia. It's interesting. Some people associate the song with the March on the Pentagon to protest the Vietnam War in 1967. Others believe it's a lament for the Kent State University students who were gunned down by US troops in 1970. But here's the thing. Stephen Stills wrote that song in 1966 to protest a police curfew on Whiskey A Go-Go, the Los Angeles nightclub where Buffalo Springfield was the house band. So I think we have to ask, why do people continue to nurture their fantasy readings of the song nearly 50 years after its author confirmed its very mundane origin? And the answer to that question is at the core of what David and Bob and I are going to be discussing today. Whatever their factual basis, the song's allusions to paranoia and reaction are an echo of themes explored in Richard Hofstadter's 1964 essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which David and Bob and I have been discussing. The modern right wing, Hofstadter wrote, feels dispossessed. America has been taken away from them and their kind, though they are determined to try to repossess it and to prevent the final destructive act of subversion. Well, now, nearly 60 years later, a particular American set of mind continues to see this perceived dispossession in apocalyptic terms. As Hofstadter wrote, they traffic in the birth and death of the whole political order, whole systems of human values, the entire world. Well, David, Hofstadter disclaimed any interest really in exploring the psychopathology of political actors, but I wonder whether it's possible to gain any psychological insights about Trump and his supporters by examining their belief systems through Hofstadter's lens.
Well, yes, Mace, I think we can. The paranoid style, or more simply paranoia, is a more advanced form of psychological defense known as projection. And projection is a process by which a person's unconscious feelings and negative self-introjects, or internalized shame, is attributed to others. These projections might include profound feelings of inferiority and jealousy, smoldering anger and resentment, or repressed conflicted sexuality that become expressed in the form of prejudice, fears of conspiratorial plots, deep cynicism, and injustice collecting.
Can I, hold on, help me understand that last point. What is injustice collecting?
A fancy term, yes. Injustice collecting is essentially the accumulation of grievances. It flows from a basic position of powerlessness, victimhood, and the lack of agency in or ownership for one's life and life circumstances. As such, projection functions as a primitive, unconscious avoidance of ownership for one's own feelings, thoughts, actions, and circumstances. The 21-year-old gunman in the recent shootings in Atlanta is a vivid example of unwanted sexual arousal and energy being projected onto others who are seen incorrectly and irresponsibly as the source of sexual distress. And this is the enormous destructive power of a fundamental human biological and psychological drive that has run amok. And so is it a surprise that the shooter has been described by those who know him as a devout Christian? This horrific event is an example of what can occur when simple and fundamental religious doctrine is used in place of deeper self-reflection and self-examination. So when Hofstadter's paranoid spokesman resorts to a defensive posture of pathological pride or pathological narcissism, it creates a psychopathy characterized by delusional ideation, callousness, detachment, blunted affective states, remorselessness, and deficits in empathy, often masked by a manipulative, glib, and even charismatic exterior or mask.
Does that sound like anyone we know?
What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people.
The video played outside the White House during Trump's January 6th Stop the Steal rally, just minutes before his supporters stormed the US Capitol, seems to fit, David, your and Hofstadter's analysis perfectly, doesn't it?
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. That all changes starting right here and and right now.
Note the many subliminal messages. The Hollywood sign in Los Angeles, which of course is a dog whistle for Jews, the General Assembly and the EU Parliament, proxies for world government. More than one clip of Joe Biden altered to make him appear cognitively impaired. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who is Jewish, wearing African kente cloth. Images of dead soldiers, of homelessness, of white poverty and despair, empty streets and subway cars and schools. In a second, you'll see that even the Supreme Court is conflated with Black Lives Matter. And always Trump, triumphant among his throngs of admirers, factories humming, rockets lifting off, jet fighters flying overhead, a rising stock market, and over again, Trump himself as a portrait of steely resolve. And our intrepid technical director, Jake Jansen, has pointed out that playing beneath it all is a cover of Linkin Park's song, In the End, which goes, I tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter. So I think the message is clear, David. America's glory has been betrayed by alien elites seeking to undermine and destroy the nation. And to save it, we must restore Trump. Now, I want to move ahead a little bit here and talk a bit about denial, because I think there is an aspect of denial in the paranoid style, denial of facts and of science. As Hofstadter noted, the paranoid style almost always involves a leap into fantasy. I'd like to see if we can understand what people get out of embracing demonstrable falsehoods, David. What's going on with both the people who tell the lies and the people who believe them? And I want to give a couple of examples, one of which continues to trouble me. It occurred actually near where I used to live in Washington, D.C. during the 2016 US presidential campaign, when Alex Jones and other right-wing provocateurs promoted what I hope we can agree is the insane notion that Hillary Clinton was sexually abusing children in the basement of Comet Ping Pong, a neighborhood pizza joint in Washington, D.C. Protesters began to picket the restaurant. They threatened its employees. And then there is Edgar Welch, who one day after listening to Alex Jones's show, drove his pickup truck from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., walked into Comet Pizza and opened fire with an AR-15 automatic rifle. And what he said was a good faith mission to find and rescue the kidnapped children. And just as frightening, and I would argue more consequential, is the big lie about the 2020 election, which, as we know, has convinced Trump supporters that in fighting for Trump, they are not subverting the government, but actually are defending it. So, David, does the liar believe the lie? Does Alex Jones really believe that Hillary Clinton was raping children in a pizzeria basement? Does Trump believe he won the election? Do Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley believe that he did? Are they crazy or cynical opportunists or both? And what about Edgar Welch? What about the people who believe them?
Well, these are excellent questions, Mace, and I can't say that I have a fully adequate answer for them. But for the most part, people believe what they wish to believe is true. And as such, they often unreflectively believe those things that serve their own self-interests and support their pre-existing belief systems. People also believe information that they hear repeated most frequently and most strenuously, and hence the power of propaganda. And we also know from behavioral economics that people can be egregiously poor at calculating risk and reward, and thereby are unable to make sound analytical decisions. So I suppose the answer to your question is that both propositions are correct. People are both crazy and opportunistic. And we should remember that all humans are primates. Basically, we're animals who not infrequently operate in unconscious and occasionally irrational knee-jerk stimulus response patterns. And we humans also possess robust emotional circuitry that, when activated without the countervailing benefit of an equally robust moral, self-reflective, and analytical cognitive system, can easily lead us into dark alleys of primitive and destructive behavior.
Well, that's really interesting, and I guess it may explain why the paranoid style often seems to elevate subjective belief over objective empirical facts. Hofstadter actually noted that the paranoid style obsessively searches for evidence in order to prove that the unbelievable is actually the only thing that can be believed. So, maybe we need to go down a different path here, and maybe we should be asking whether we should regard Trumpism as a religion, and Trump as, I don't know, some sort of god.
Well, it is interesting to me that Trump has been regarded as something of a messiah by many Christian evangelicals. And interestingly, Trump's constant acts of self-aggrandizement and power mongering have a certain quality of godlike envy or godlike wannabeism. And it is noteworthy that former George Bush speechwriter Michael Gerson has recently referred to Trump as the, quote, God King of Crazy Town. Apparently in Crazy Town, the truth becomes whatever Trump, the God King, says it is. So, Trump therefore might be viewed as a warped version of both Hegel's and Kant's, for you German philosophy students, their concept of the self-realized man as God. Trump is warped by his inability to self-reflect and entertain uncertainty, and thereby lacks the tension and growth-producing force of the Hegelian dialectic. And instead, his unspoken but obvious rejection of God and morality, by which he has essentially become a nihilistic Nietzschean Übermensch, a fallen archangel, a corrupted quasi-religious figure whose purpose, it seems, is to sow mass confusion and chaos. And here in this slide, we see the fallen archangel Lucifer, whom you will recall was subverted by his major cardinal sin of pride in attempting to assert himself as God's equal. But as with the fallen angel Lucifer, Trump manages to charismatically attract and mesmerize an enormous cast of followers who believe that he is the one true God, rather than the possibility of a false prophet. Now, in contrast to Trump's mesmerized followers, perhaps his former chief of staff, General John Kelly, captured the essence of Trump best when he described Trump as, quote, the most flawed person I've ever met.
Well, that's a lot to take in, David. I wonder, you seem to be describing a sort of marriage of false prophecy and group psychosis. On the other hand, it occurs to me that those might be the same thing.
Well, I was reminded recently while speaking with a woman about her brilliant bipolar disordered sister who for years had kept her family in crazed upheaval and chaos. And it reminded me of the very similar effect that Trump has had on the United States. The mixture of a religiostic and manic energy and fervor in a profoundly disordered personality can coalesce into a frighteningly corrupted, powerful, and destructive energy and essence.
Well, I think that leads us to a final question. Perhaps it's an inevitable one, and it is, David, how are those of us who live in a fact-based environment, or at least like to think that we do, to engage in constructive dialogue with folks who appear uninterested in doing so? Is it even possible? Is there a way for us to reach each other?
Well, yes, I believe so, Mace. And I would refer to Milton Erickson and Carl Rogers, two eminent psychological thinkers from the mid-20th century, who offered a solution, I think, to this dilemma, which they described as interested or empathic listening. Both Erickson and Rogers were adept psychotherapists who were able to form deep connections by entering their patients' subjective worlds while withholding judgment and evaluation. And in 1961, Rogers wrote that, and I'm quoting from his book, quote, "The major obstacle to mutual interpersonal communication is our very natural tendency to judge, to evaluate, to approve or disapprove the statements of another person or group. Real communication occurs," he goes on, "and this evaluative tendency is avoided when we listen with understanding. This means that we see the expressed idea and attitude from the other person's point of view, to sense how it actually feels to them, to achieve their frame of reference." Now, Rogers' program of research, which he did extensively, demonstrated that this form of listening could release potent forces of change, leading to major changes in human personality. And at the same time, Rogers conceded that interested empathic listening, while conceptually simple, is actually quite difficult in practice. In particular, he recognized that such listening, quote, "requires courage. For if you are willing to enter the private world of another person, seeing things as they see them without evaluative judgment, you run the risk of being changed yourself. If we enter the world of a psychotic individual, isn't there the risk that we might become lost there in their psychosis?" Now, Milton Erickson was like-minded. One of Erickson's famous teaching stories arose from his therapeutic interaction with a hospitalized man diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. This man had been extremely difficult to treat, as he was entrenched in the belief that he was the second coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. One afternoon, Erickson encountered the man at an outdoor bench on the hospital grounds and seized the opportunity for conversation. Erickson gently approached the man, expressed a warm greeting, and volunteered his understanding that the patient was, quote, "a carpenter." Not eliciting a denial, Erickson ventured further, asking the gentleman if he would be willing to help build a new set of bookshelves for the hospital library, an offer that the man clearly could not refuse, and which became a turning point in his treatment. So this brief and tactical intervention demonstrates Erickson's willingness to enter another person's delusional world and, without judgment, use the assumptions of that world to evoke positive change. Empathic listening and understanding is challenging, difficult work, but clearly work that offers a potentially large reward for the risk that it seems to require.
That's really that's incredible stuff. It makes me remember that I left my hammer and saw outside before we started the webinar. Just kidding. Seriously, it does sound as if the work that you've described could be vitally important as we try to confront the challenges we face on climate, inequality, and other matters.
Paranoia strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Children, what's that sound?
Such a great song, isn't it? But that means, Bob, that it's your turn, and I think you are going to offer some reflections on these themes, but from a Canadian perspective.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the whole new spin on rock and roll. I'd like to thank you both for an absolutely riveting examination of what has become of truth in American politics and social discourse. I'd like now, if I may, to offer some observations on the extent of American populism and the undermining of truth that has, under the cover of darkness, crossed our very permeable border with the United States into Canada. And in February of this year, Dr. Thomas Axworthy, who is a public policy scholar at Massey College at the University of Toronto, offered a webinar entitled Populism, Trumpism, and Extreme Discord. Is Canada Immune? The webinar was essentially about the politics of truth and inclusion versus the politics of lies and fears. Now, first, what is populism? Well, populism is defined as a political movement that challenges the incumbent political establishment based on the claim that populists, and they alone, represent the people. Unfortunately, the brands of populist leaders emerging today too often threaten to undermine and erode the foundations of liberal democracy and the rule of law. They get away with it by loudly and aggressively claiming that those who oppose them don't belong. As Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan put it, we are the people. Who are you? One of the main drivers of populism is the purposeful cultivation of extreme political and social polarization as a response, as you said, to the anxieties of the alienated and the manipulation of truth as a means of further shaping that polarization. We now find ourselves in an era where the four horsemen of the apocalypse have traded in their horses. Their new horses are pandemic, economic inequality, climate change, and the contagious and mind-altering infodemic of social media. Social media is now seen as a pandemic in its own right, in large measure because there are no standards of truth or objectivity in what is conveyed through social media, and because for more than 1/2 of all Americans and Canadians, social media is their only news source. And this is why the World Health Organization recently declared that they were battling an infodemic as much as a pandemic. And this is how Trump's base remains alive and well, and how Trump and his followers continue to fuel further social divisiveness in American society. Now, can these sensibilities infect us here in Canada? Maybe, but for the moment, we are different from the United States in fundamental ways. The number one driver of populism in Europe and the United States is immigration, which is not an issue in Canada, certainly not the issue it is in the United States or in Europe. And one reason for that is that in our electoral system, it's very difficult to win on an anti-immigrant platform in the heavily populated suburbs of Montreal or Toronto, which are largely comprised of immigrants. And there's another factor that's different in Canada. Voters here are a lot more fluid in changing their party allegiances than in the United States. So how do we prevent the growing threat of populism that would undermine democracy in Canada? Tom Axworthy's response: we must start with a mindset that refuses to demonize the other. All opinions must be respected. We must recognize that freedom of expression is critical. We must push back as quickly as possible on assaults on that freedom so that we don't fuel further divisiveness. And this means we must come down hard on elected representatives at all levels who can't be civil and can't be tolerant. We also need to work out how we can maintain the critical role of journalism and local opinion in the age of internet. We need to find a vaccine for this misinfodemic that has insinuated itself into the stable of horses that the four horsemen have ridden with us into the Anthropocene. As a means of halting societal divisiveness, Dr. Axworthy made reference to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was able to speak in language that successfully appealed to both sides of the political spectrum. And hopefully Joe Biden will have that power also. In this uncertain time, we need to remain, however, very aware of what's happening in the United States. That the Republicans very nearly won the 2020 election suggests that Americans should expect a long and ugly war within that party, in which truth and objectivity will undoubtedly be major casualties. We must stand by our neighbors while they go through this terrible struggle. And in the meantime, populism is an assault on truth against which we must remain fully on guard in Canada. Fully 1/4 of Canadians embrace populism in one form or another, which suggests that it's already infected our country. The hotbeds? Well, certainly Alberta, where 35% of the population is very open to populism, and where voters have elected a premier who borrows heavily from the Trump playbook. But it isn't just Alberta that's unhappy. There are 6,600 online channels, pages, groups, and accounts across several media platforms where Canadians and who knows who else spread extremist views to 11 million other Canadians. It would be helpful in this to be reminded of the words of our national anthem. There are ripples of populism in Canada, certainly, but as yet, no wave. Let's keep it that way. Truth matters. O Canada, we do stand on guard for thee. Over to you, Frances.
Well, that was brilliant. Thank you. And I just love that you mentioned that we need to really stress engagement and conversation to deal with opposing views. Otherwise, we'll never find that middle ground. So I see John is on the screen. Would you like to add anything, John?
No, I was very much impressed with the presentations. I did finally get in to hear them all. Remember, this is all about how we have to deal with this myriad of lies and misinformation, because we can't get to climate neutrality without a much clearer sense of purpose. And we have to clear away some of this debris and align ourselves with a clearer path to get to carbon neutrality. So it's a bump in the road that has to be dealt with. That's why we brought it onto this program.
Well done. Yes, thank you. Dr. Andrew Hoffman is a professor of sustainable enterprise at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business and School for Environment and Sustainability, and a Winspear Fellow at the University of Victoria's Gustavson School of Business. So Dr. Hoffman's research, teaching, and writing examines the ways that environmental issues emerge as managerial, economic, and political concerns. And he has been featured in the New York Times, Scientific America, Time, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and on National Public Radio. Dr. Hoffman has published 18 books and more than 100 articles and book chapters, many of which have won major awards. Welcome, Dr. Hoffman. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's seeing the picture of me without a beard kind of caught me off guard.
Yes, it's good that you're speaking, because people might go, where is he? So you have 2 new books being released shortly, or they've just been released, I gather. March 7th.
Saying that I obviously didn't finish them at the same time, but they both got released on March 2nd. One book is called Management as a Calling, and I'm really trying to push the idea of people in business to think of as management as a vocation, to serve and not just accumulate. And the second book is called The Engaged Scholar, and I'm really trying to challenge academics to be more involved in public and political discourse. Akin to the previous presentation, we have a role as academics to bring knowledge and truth, that's our stock and trade, out into the world. And unfortunately, the incentives within academia are not there to do it. We are rewarded for writing academic publications for other academics and to be cited by other academics. And I think that needs to change as one of many antidotes to the problems of disinformation and misinformation that we're facing today.
Excellent, yes. So can you please explain what aspects of market and corporate culture are failing when dealing with climate emergency and biodiversity loss?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would start. I was trying to think of the segue from the prior to this, and I thought there's a quote by John F. Kennedy that I really like. He says, "You can't have the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." And a lot of people are just repeating stale tropes, perpetuating myths, and within the market, there are some myths that continue that are destructive. I could walk up to any student. I could probably walk up to anyone in downtown Victoria or Vancouver and put a mic in front of them and say, finish this sentence. The purpose of the corporation is, and they will parrot back, make money for the shareholder. Now, that's not true. Some people even believe the law says they have to do that. That's not true either. The purpose of the corporation, in the words of Peter Drucker, if we go back to the 50s and 60s, is to identify and serve a market. And how much money they make is a measure of how well they do that. And once you invert that, you start to have some problems. You have short-term time horizons. You have a focus on self-interest. John Gamble, a corporate attorney, wrote a really nice essay saying that the system in which CEOs work right now compels them to be sociopaths, care about nobody but themselves. That all comes from this idea of shareholder primacy, that the shareholder is the only thing that matters. And that privilege is one type of shareholder, which would jump ship at any moment, doesn't care about the long term, just wants to make their money right away. And that obviously is not healthy for the company, it's not healthy for the economy. Other myths. I am stunned how many of my students and how many people in general society think that the government has no role in the market and regulation is an unwarranted intrusion in the market. And that's just not true either. Capitalism is not some natural state. It is a set of rules that are set and defined by the government. The debate we have in the United States of more or less government is a really dumb debate. We really need to shift to what kind of government, what kind of interaction that we can have there. So akin to the book that I talked about, I am trying to push management education to start to think about a vocational calling, to think more about the society of which they're part, to think of being a steward of the market and maintain its integrity, make sure it works, and not just look at a broken system and figure out how to game it. Because the fact is, if we keep producing business students that care only about themselves and how rich they can make themselves, quite simply, we're doomed. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to deal with climate change or biodiversity loss or income inequality, these solutions have to come with the market. And the market, I mean corporations, government, civil society, all working together. It has to come from the market. And within it, the most powerful entity is business. So if business doesn't solve these problems, I don't think we'll be able to solve them.
And
long answer to your question. Sorry about
no,
that.
it's a great answer. And are you finding a lot of interest and uptake in this, or does it seem genuine, or are these just like people saying, yes, we have to appear a certain way, so we'll listen to what you have to say? Is there real genuine interest?
Yeah, there's obviously going to mix of both. I mean, greenwashing is a real phenomenon. Companies out there pretending they're doing something that they're not. I mean, it's out there. I can tell you that the students I'm teaching really resonate with this idea. And people ask me, you know, are you hopeful? And I say, yes. And they say, that's because you're around students. I say, precisely. 20 years ago, when I first got started as a professor, most students who wanted to change the world for the better went into schools of government and nonprofit management. Today, more and more are going into schools of business. What they recognize, and I think what we need to get across is, as a business manager, as an executive, as a CEO, you have tremendous power within our society. And with that power comes tremendous responsibility. And we need to connect that responsibility to their actions. I think we should have better institutions to hold people accountable. But so with the young people, I'm seeing a lot. And you do see some change, you know, Paul Pullman at Unilever, others that are trying to shift the norms of the market, but they change slowly, a lot of inertia.
So what are the solutions to align the corporate sector with achieving carbon neutrality?
Well, I mean, I'm already intrigued that the debate over shareholder primacy has been engaged. The World Economic Forum, the Business Roundtable, BlackRock, they've all come out and said, no, the purpose of the corporation is more than the shareholder. That they have an obligation to pay their fair taxes, even though many of them don't. They have an obligation to protect the natural environment, that we need to start to rethink the purpose of the corporation and the purpose of the CEO in guiding that corporation. That's interesting to me. Now, those are aspirational statements. I want to see it put into practice, and that's the really difficult challenge. I also find it intriguing that the debate has been engaged. Companies are talking about carbon neutral or even carbon negative. And if you had asked me 5 or 6 years ago, I would have thought that would stayed a conversation, a bunch of academics, and it's really entered the mainstream. And you can't really find the true solutions until you ask the right questions. And reducing carbon keeps you in the same mindset. I'll screw in an LED light bulb, I'll turn the thermostat down, problem solved. No, it won't solve the problem. If you really want to challenge creative thinking, carbon neutrality or carbon negative, you need to re-examine the entire system. That's where the answers lie. And so that I find is interesting. And then in terms of shifting the market, the insurance sector is really starting to wake up to this issue. And to my mind, the insurance sector is the canary in the coal mine. The reinsurance sector has been on this for a while. If you're not familiar, reinsurance companies insure insurance companies. That may sound like a redundancy, but it's not. They have a longer time horizon. They have a wider risk portfolio. But insurance companies now have suddenly woken up. I mean, 2 years ago, Warren Buffett said something that caused a lot of controversy. He said, my insurance companies don't need to worry about this because we rewrite our policies on an annual basis. And now it's become pretty clear you're in big trouble if you do that, because look at the California wildfires. Look at the insurance payouts that are going to come from that, are coming from that. They're enormous. too late to change your policies come December when it's time to flip those policies. So insurance companies are really starting to wake up to this issue and change their underwriting practices, change their consulting practices, which is what they do when they change their underwriting practices. And then one last thing, I think that the financial sector is starting to move on this issue. The growth in ESG investing has been quite steep, and interestingly, in the COVID crisis, gone up even more. People are looking for good corporate citizens to put their money in, and I find that quite interesting. So there are changes. I'm not going to say we're done. I'm not going to say it's solved, but we're moving in the right direction, and there's a role for everybody to keep the pressure going.
When you mentioned ESG investments, is that what you said?
Yeah, environment, social, and governance. It's impact investing. You can think about it that way. Thinking about more than just the return, the share price return, but thinking about what the company does and how they impact their natural and social environments.
Well, interestingly enough, it seems that there's just been a recent media report that a lot of companies, the big banks, are investing more heavily than ever in fossil fuels. So what is going on? It's quite confusing. There's
Well, that's where transparency is a wonderful thing, and these stories are coming out. The Guardian had one today. The Globe and Mail had one today, pointing out that for all the talk, there is still actions that are contrary to their stated goals. And so I forget who said this. I think it was Dow Chemical said, "Don't trust us, track us." So statements, they're aspirational statements, track them, watch them, call it out, apply more pressure. It's the only way we're going to get there.
That's good. So that's how corporations have to deal with the truth, I suppose. They have to walk their talk, and people are going to call them out if they don't. And I mean,
look at what companies do on their lobbying efforts. I mean, that needs to be more transparent. And there's a lot of pressure now to expose the pressure that corporations put on governments to perhaps block climate policy. Not only their direct pressure, but the pressure they apply through their trade associations. This is very important, or through their PACs. A lot of companies will hide behind the trade association to apply pressure to slow down progress on things like climate change. And that needs to be exposed and brought out.
Andy, I'd love to see you again.
Hey.
In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be talking about how people can lower their carbon footprint. So what can people do to make corporations more accountable? How do you make sure that they implement some of these aspirational promises and don't wriggle off the hook?
Well, I mean, learn, be aware, understand what they're doing, call it out. Tip O'Neill famously said, "All politics is local." And I think one important point about getting people to recognize the reality of climate change is to hear from people they know. It's nice for the luminaries to talk about these issues. It's nice for me, I guess, to sit here in Ann Arbor and talk to you folks on Vancouver Island. And my wife is there. I'm talking to her through this right now. But when people hear it from people that they know and trust, it changes the conversation. And so talk about climate change, talk about what corporations are doing. Don't trust them. Don't recite, simple tropes. Okay, I'm going to buy an electric car, problem solved. It's not that simple. And we need to think more in more detail. I mean, what are we going to do with the heavy metals that come out of those batteries? How is that electricity going to be created? Is the answer really another hunk of steel with wheels? Or is it we need to start to rethink mobility so that we don't own that hunk of steel with wheels, we just buy the service it provides? Start to think differently and then apply pressure in whatever way you can. I mean, right now, another thing that gives me hope is the youth movement on climate change. It's quite strong. It's an important point because prior to this, there was no clear constituency that was going to be impacted by climate change. But young people now are an aggrieved party. And they're really calling attention to the fact that you're doing this to me. This is a social equity issue. And then the racial justice movement coming in and saying, we're affecting minority populations, disadvantaged populations disproportionately. It creates a social movement, and employers see this, and they want to connect with their employee base. And so they're starting to move on this issue too. So if you have the nerve, start to look at your investments and start to move them. There are plenty of social responsible investment funds out there. If you want to go for specific companies, you can do that too, but I do mutual funds, or there are even index funds off of sustainable asset management or the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So find every way you can to act in a way that is consistent with your concern over climate change. Communicate it to others, lead by example. And if you really want to go further, borrowing the term from John Lewis, practice some good trouble. Go ahead and pick at a company if you want. Go ahead and start a social media campaign. Companies are much more sensitive than you think. I had a panel 2 years ago where there was an executive from, maybe I won't use the name of the company, but it's a company you all know and have probably shopped in, who said something that my jaw hit the floor, but she said, "We live in fear of the tweet." Think about that. The power you have in your hands. And even on a personal level, if you ever got really bad service, you tweet it, you get answers. It's really, we have much more power than we think, and exercise it in ways that you find useful.
That's so encouraging. Thank you. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling good to hear those really simple but effective solutions. And there is a question I'm just going to jump to. We're going to questions and answers, but Kathy Code asked, do we have time for corporations in the market to finally realize a more environmentally responsible role while not expecting government subsidies so they can do business?
That's a great question. Will the market move at a pace that matches our ecological realities? It's a very good question. I have two answers. One, markets and societies for that matter do not move in a linear fashion. They go through massive step jumps. You can think about certain events that have caused a sudden shift in the market. The Bhopal disaster literally changed insurance in a matter of weeks, if not sooner. The CEO of Union Carbide, there was an arrest warrant on him, and the insurance company saw that and saw the payouts and said, "We are totally unprepared for this," and they withdrew from insurance, and the market suddenly shifted. So it can shift rapidly, and so there's my answer number one: hold out for the hope that. And when an event happens, that's where it's key. Events just they need to be framed in a certain way. So if take the Gulf oil spill. That wasn't framed as an environmental issue, totally missed opportunity. It was framed as a jobs issue. And so no change happened. So frame it for what it is. That was climate change. That hurricane was climate, call it out. The second thing is, I tend to be pragmatic about this, because if it's not the market, what is going to do this? I don't know. I hear, a lot of people saying we need to destroy the market and come up with a new system, but I just don't see that as a plausible option. In human history, we've never had a chance to just sort of wipe the slate clean and come up with a new system. It doesn't work that way. What we need to do is start from where we are, go where we need to go. That's the only option to my mind before us. But, I think one thing is, consistent with the theme of the prior session, one myth that we suffer from in our social discourse today is that for me to be right, you have to be wrong. And there are many answers here. I don't propose my approach to be the one and only answer. But as a business school professor, trying to usher out the next generation of business leaders, this is the avenue I've chosen. But I do feel pretty strongly that if the market doesn't solve this, it won't be solved.
Excellent. Well said. Well, we have a lot of questions, and I want to give everyone an opportunity to be asked several of these questions. So thank you, Dr. Hoffman. That's wonderful. Jonathan, are you okay if we move on to questions? But do you have anything you'd like to add at this moment?
No, not at all. Move on to other questions.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do that. So is crisis management our way out? I guess that's it. Maybe that's over to you, Andy, one more time.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I mean, do we need a crisis? Change always happens, sudden change, transformational change happens when the system is disrupted, when there is a discontinuity. I don't want to get wonky and academic here, but when when something doesn't make sense. We never knew about hazardous waste disposal until Love Canal, and suddenly we woke up to it and everything changes. Think about 9/11. After 9/11, things changed literally overnight. What was possible on 9/12 was not possible on 9/10. Sudden events make this possible. So I wouldn't call it crisis management, but in the words of Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's former chief of staff, he said, never waste a good crisis. If a crisis happens.
Yeah, could I add to that too, Andrew? I think that's really an important statement. And in a sense, looking at it from a UN point of view, we are presently at the beginning of a long emergency. And one of the things that we've learned from COVID, and I suppose it's about crisis management, is that we are pretty well organized for singular crises generally, but we're not well organized in any society for multiple crises simultaneously. And you look, for example, at the American US West in 2020, you had floods, droughts, extraordinary forest fires, respiratory problems associated with that, and then you had COVID on top of it. And I think multiple emergencies is something that we're going to have to become more accustomed to and respond to.
Mm-hmm. And these emergencies are nested. They're not disconnected.
They're nested, exactly.
And that's a key too, is that they roll over each other. Because when I look at the COVID crisis, I look at it as a catalyst for exposing some of the problems in the market. I mean, prior to COVID, the Federal Reserve did a study and they came up with the conclusion that 40% of Americans could not pull together $400 in emergency. They're in that emergency now, and COVID has made that clear. And, in COVID, some of our institutions, they stressed and they held, some of them stressed and they broke. And I hope one thing that comes out of COVID is recognizing that balkanization, me first,
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. When we're faced with a collective global crisis like COVID and like climate change, we have to find ways to work together.
A question here from Lynn says, my bank says that green technologies aren't public because the industry is too small. So they can't be in mutual funds. What is her rebuttal?
There's a lot of, what is a green tech? Is the electric car green tech? I would argue not. It's a market shift. Ask anyone in the auto sector, what's the future of the auto sector? It's electric. Now, again, that's not the answer, because we need to rethink mobility and start to allow people to move around. I love that the auto companies think that China is their big new market. If you've been to Shanghai and seen the traffic, a few years ago, China had a 10-day traffic jam. The answer is not more cars. The answer is a different way of getting us around. So those, that kind of technology, renewable energy, that's in the market. And there are private equity funds that are very interested in this sector. And that's where some of the smaller startups will go to get their money. And the truth is, a lot of big companies are starting to prefer private equity too. That's why BlackRock is so huge, because the market is fickle. The market is unreliable. Just watch Elon Musk have one of his tirades against his shareholders. He can't stand them meddling in his business. And so, the private equity is out there. The market is out there. The mutual funds, the stocks are out there too.
There's a comment here. People have an easier time imagining the end of the world as we know it from climate change rather than the end of capitalism.
Well, you could look at it this way. Sooner or later, things have to change. Just how far up against the wall are we going to get before the shift starts to occur?
Well, just noticing that even in rock and roll, since we were talking about that earlier, just look at the difference between the 50s and the 60s. Things are shifting, and look at the 60s from the 40s. Things are happening, and that's very encouraging. So what hope do you have that governments will lead us through this massive change, and how will they lead the market?
That's a tough one. I'm nervous about the state of governments in my country and the global institutions. How can they be shored up? The partisanship in Washington is just, it's left it totally dysfunctional. And I talked to numerous people in the corporate sector, CEOs, who are starting to step forward and saying, okay, government can't do the job, we're going to do it. I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, it's a pragmatic answer. They're going to step in. But on the other hand, we can't live at the largesse of corporations. We need a strong government to step forward and say, we need a carbon price. Although, if the corporate sector starts to roll on an issue, it makes things easier. If it even, talk about hell freezing over. If you saw last week, the American Petroleum Institute is coming out with a policy statement supporting a carbon price. I mean,
yes.
the market is shifting.
Thank you.
I think it's quite interesting, if I could just add to that, one of the things from a global perspective is that we're seeing how dangerous it is to become atomized, and the only solution is to work together. And what the World Health Organization is calling for is we need better all government, all private sector, all civic sector society pushes to address common global problems. And I think that's become a very clear here that you can't do that. And one thing that COVID did is it certainly showed who performed and who you could trust. And science was highest among that.
Thank you.
That's true. And government was at the bottom.
In some places, that's for sure, isn't it? Yeah.
As of now, propagating misinformation and disinformation is a major business model for various media. Is there a regulatory role for government without stepping on the First Amendment?
I struggle with that one. That's a great question, because there are people who make money by sowing disinformation and misinformation, dividing us. There are people that make money doing this. And what's the recourse? I mean, I think it's a sad commentary that the only time you can catch someone and hold them accountable for a lie is if your monetary interests have been affected. And I'm talking about the Dominion lawsuits against Trump administration, Giovanni. I think that's pretty sad that the only time we can call out a lie is if I lose money by your lie. Other than that, everything's game. And then also to leave that decision to certain CEOs, Mark Zuckerberg, who I'm not impressed that he is equipped to be the arbiter of truth in our society. So this is a tough one, and I don't know how we're going to resolve this, because someone brought it up in one of the comments, the social media, its power to create confusion, this information overload that we have, and our inability to distinguish between good and quality information and politically inspired disinformation is pretty poor. So how do we tame this beast?
Well, it's interesting. I just add that in the States right now, we're in the middle of a legislative and legal fight over exactly that issue pertaining to a provision in the Communications Act in the States that is colloquially referred to as Section 230. Section 230 of our Communications Act essentially absolves social media and any internet operator from any liability for content that is posted online by its users. Essentially, it turns them into common carriers, like think about Canada Post or the US Postal Service. And the idea behind that provision was precisely to encourage the proliferation of ideas and the free exchange of antagonistic ideas over the internet without censorship by the social media platforms that were disseminating those ideas. Well, now everybody's having second thoughts about it. Former President Trump began an initiative that's been taken up by other Republicans actually to repeal Section 230. And the idea would be, going to Andy's point, that would then open up social media and Mark Zuckerberg and others to legal action for libel or defamation and so on for the material that I might post on their sites. Obviously, there are some very difficult ramifications of that approach that would need to be sorted out. And also, I would just add, and I know our time is short, that I'm not sure that Donald Trump and his folks thought through the implications of their view, because of course it would blow up on them for all this disinformation disseminated by them and their supporters over the internet too. And of course, that's all under the overlay of the First Amendment in the States, which prohibits the government from interfering with the dissemination of most speech, notably not including obscene speech or child pornography. So it's a very knotty issue, and I suspect it's going to be fought out by the lobbyists, including some corporations, for months, if not years to come.
What a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much. And looking at the time and looking at the questions, we will be posting the questions that didn't get answered to the live, to the webinar replay, which will be ready early next week. So thank you so much, Mace, David, Robert, and Andrew, and John. Thank you so very much. Before we end, I just feel like we need to just share one thing here, and it's this little quote. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know, by John Keats. So John, over to you real quick to tell us what is coming up in our next webinar 2 weeks from now.
Well, a number of you have been talking to Francis and I about what we do as individuals to reduce our carbon footprint. So in 2 weeks' time, we're actually going to deal with that question head on. We've got 3 excellent presenters, one from the UK, giving an international perspective on how we can take a ton of carbon out of our lives, one from this regional area that deals with Southwest Vancouver and the Oregon area, where we're looking at ways to reduce carbon footprints in projects through teaching and engagement. And then finally, a local person, Todd Littman from the Greater Victoria area, who is an expert in transportation, housing, and energy, and how we can reduce our carbon footprint right here in the Greater Victoria area. So we've always wanted to think about how I can do my job in reducing the carbon footprint. 2 weeks' time, that's your webinar. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. It's been fantastic. Stay tuned for the replay and we'll get your questions answered then. Have a great rest of your week. See you April 7th. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.